Later, when he drove this tribe from the city, he was careful to require that they leave behind their metalworking tools so that the Muslims could now manufacture weapons for themselves. Muhammad was eventually able to supply weapons, helmets, shields, and armor for an army of 10,000 for his march on Mecca. Muhammad's ability to obtain sufficient weapons and equipment had another important advantage. Many of the insurgency's converts came from the poorest elements of the Bedouin clans, people too impoverished to afford weapons and armor. Muhammad often supplied these converts with expensive military equipment, immediately raising their status within the clan, and guaranteeing their loyalty to him, if not always to the creed of Islam. In negotiations with Bedouin chiefs, Muhammad made them gifts of expensive weaponry. Several pagan clans were won over to Muhammad's insurgency in this manner, although they did not convert to Islam. Horses and camels were equally important military assets, for without them raids and the conduct of operations over distances were not possible. Muhammad obtained his animals in much the same manner as he did his weapons, and with equal success. At Badr the insurgents had only 2 horses. 6 years later at Hunain, Muhammad's cavalry squadrons numbered 800 horses and cavalrymen. 12. An insurgency must also be able to sustain the popular base that supports the fighting elements. To accomplish this, Muhammad changed the ancient customs regarding the sharing of booty taken in raids. The chief of a clan or tribe traditionally took 1/4 of the booty for himself. Muhammad decreed that he receive only 1/5, and even this he took not for himself, but in the name of the Ummah. Under the old ways, individuals kept whatever booty they had captured. Muhammad required that all booty be turned into the common pool, where it was shared equally among all combatants who had participated in the raid. Most importantly, Muhammad established that the first claimants on the booty that had been taken in the name of the Ummah were the poor and the widows and orphans of the soldiers killed in battle. He also used the promise of a larger share of booty to strike alliances with Bedouin clans, some of whom remained both loyal and pagan to the end, fighting for loot instead of Islam. Muhammad's later military successes against towns, oases, and caravans provided an important source of wealth to supply the insurgent popular base with the necessities of life. The leader of an insurgency must take great care to guard his power from challenges, including those that come from within the movement itself. Muhammad had many enemies, and he was always on guard against an attempt on his life. Like other insurgent leaders, Muhammad surrounded himself with a loyal group of men who would act as his bodyguard and carry out his orders without question. Muhammad created the Safa precisely for this purpose. The Safa was a small cadre who lived in the mosque next to Muhammad's house. They were recruited from among the most pious, enthusiastic, and fanatical followers, and were generally from impoverished backgrounds with no other way to make a living. The members of the Safa spent their time studying Islam and leading a life of spiritual avocation. They were devoted to Muhammad and served not only as his lifeguard, but as a secret police that could be called on at a moment's notice to carry out whatever task Muhammad set for them. These tasks included assassination and terror. No insurgency can survive without an effective intelligence apparatus, and the Muslim insurgency was no exception. As early as when Muhammad left Mecca, he left behind a trusted agent, his uncle Abbas, who continued to send him reports on the situation there. Abbas served as an agent in place for more than a decade, until Mecca itself fell to Muhammad. In the beginning, Muhammad's operation suffered from a lack of tactical intelligence. His followers were mostly townspeople, and had no experience in desert travel. On some of the early operations, Muhammad had to hire Bedouin guides to show him the way to where he wanted to go. As the insurgency grew, however, Muhammad's intelligence service became more organized and sophisticated, using agents in place, commercial spies, debriefing of prisoners, combat patrols, and reconnaissance in force as methods of intelligence collection. Muhammad himself seems to have possessed a detailed knowledge of clan loyalties and politics within the insurgency's area of operations, and used this knowledge to good effect when negotiating alliances with the Bedouins. Muhammad often conducted an advance reconnaissance of the battlefields upon which he fought, and only once in 10 years of military operations was he taken by surprise. In most cases, Muhammad's intelligence service was able to provide him with sufficient information as to the enemy's location and intentions in advance of any military engagement. We have no knowledge of how Muhammad's intelligence service was organized or where it was located. That it was part of the Safa seems a reasonable guess. Insurgencies succeed or fail to the degree that they are able to win the allegiance of the great numbers of the uncommitted to support the insurgents' goals. Muhammad understood the role of propaganda in the struggle for the hearts and minds of the uncommitted, and went to great lengths to make his message public and widely known. In an Arab society that was largely illiterate, the poet served as the chief conveyor of political propaganda. Muhammad hired the best poets money could buy to sing his praises and denigrate his opponents. He publicly issued proclamations regarding the revelations he received as the messenger of God, and remained always in public view to keep the vision of the new order and the promise of a heavenly paradise constantly before his followers and those he hoped to convert. He sent missionaries to other clans and tribes to instruct the pagans in the new faith, sometimes teaching the pagans to read and write in the process. Muhammad understood that the conflict was between the existing social order and its manifest injustices, and his vision of the future, and he surpassed his adversaries in spreading his vision to win the struggle for the loyalty and support of the Arab population. The use of terror seems to be an indispensable element of a successful insurgency, and no less so in Muhammad's case. Muhammad used terror in two basic ways. First, to keep discipline among his followers by making public examples of traitors or backsliders. It is sometimes forgotten that in Muhammad's day the penalty for apostasy in Islam was death. Muhammad also ordered the assassination of some of his political enemies, including poets and singers who had publicly ridiculed him. Never one to forget a slight. When his armies marched into Mecca, Muhammad Safa set about hunting down a list of old enemies marked for execution. Muhammad also used terror to strike fear into the minds of his enemies on a large scale. In the case of the Jewish tribes of Medina, Muhammad seems to have ordered the death of the entire Bani Qaynuqa tribe and the selling of their women and children into slavery, before being talked out of it by the chief of one of his allies. On another occasion, again against a Jewish tribe of Medina, he ordered all the tribe's adult males, some 900, beheaded in a city square, the women and children sold into slavery, and their property distributed among his Muslim followers. Shortly after the conquest of Mecca, Muhammad declared war to the knife against all those who remained idolaters, instructing his followers to kill any pagans they encountered on the spot. Such public displays of ruthlessness and brutality, as with all insurgencies, strengthened Muhammad's hand when dealing with opponents and allies. When examined against the criteria used by modern analysts to characterize an insurgency, Muhammad's military campaign to establish Islam in Arabia seems to qualify in all respects. Nothing in this conclusion detracts from the substance and value of Islam itself as a religion any more than the history of the Israelite military campaign to conquer Canaan detracts from the substance and value of Judaism. Over time the violent origins of a religion are forgotten, and only the faith itself remains, with the result that the founders of creeds come to be remembered as untinged by the violence of the historical record. In Muhammad's case the result has been to de-emphasize the military aspects of his life and his considerable military accomplishments. One purpose of this book is to re-illuminate the historical record of Muhammad's military life. We leave the religious history of Islam's first great general to others. Research sources. Any attempt to write a military biography of Muhammad is forced to rely on only a few reliable sources of information. The first is the Quran itself, that scriptural collection of moral rules, instructions, and interpretations of events believed by Muslims to have been revealed by God to Muhammad. Whenever Muhammad experienced a revelation he would repeat its instructions to his followers, who committed them to memory. Some of these listeners may have taken notes, but the low level of literacy and scarcity of writing materials in Arabia at the time would have made this a rare occurrence. Devout Muslims believe, however, that the words of Muhammad were written down immediately after his revelations. The fact that Muhammad's words were recorded immediately is taken as proof to Muslims that the Quran contains the unadulterated Word of God. By contrast, the failure of Christians and Jews to write down God's revelations immediately is viewed as permitting human experience to corrupt His divine words. For Muslims, belief in the immediate recording of Muhammad's words is a major article of faith. Theology aside, it is likely that the Quran is the best source of the words spoken by Muhammad himself. But as a source document for the writing of military history, the Quran is only marginally useful for the pertinent information it provides. It was not collated into a single document until some 20 years after Muhammad's death, and was never intended as a narrative of the Prophet's life. The Quran is not arranged in chronological order of the occurrence of the events recorded within it. It is instead arranged in order of the length of the discourses themselves, beginning with the longest and ending with the shortest. For our purposes its most valuable contribution remains as a source of Muhammad's words in those instances where they are relevant to his military life. The most useful source of information about Muhammad's life is Ibn Ishaq's great work, The Life of Muhammad, written about 90 years after the Prophet's death, and translated into French and English by the great Arabic scholar Alfred Guillaume in 1955. Ishaq's work was edited later by Ibn Hisham, and it is the edited version that has survived. Despite Ibn Hisham's admission that he has purposely omitted things which it is disgraceful to discuss and matters which would distress certain people, his work has no serious rival as an original source of information about Muhammad and the events, especially the military events, surrounding his life. Guillaume's translation is regarded as the gold standard of translations of this source. Anyone writing about Muhammad's life must rely heavily on Ibn Ishaq, or fail to do so at great risk. Ibn Ishaq's biography of the Prophet was constructed from the Maghazi, the earliest accounts of Muhammad's life written within 100 years of his death. None of the Maghazi has survived in usable form, only a single fragment of one book exists. The Maghazi were based on oral accounts of individuals who knew the Prophet, took part in battles with him, or were close relatives of those who did. These accounts were passed down from one generation to the next in the oral tradition typical of Arab culture to this day. Ibn Ishaq is careful to cite the names of the sources of his accounts for most major events in his book, sometimes tracing a source to its previous one, and to the one before that. That these oral accounts should have survived for almost 100 years before Ibn Ishaq collected them and wrote them down is not surprising in a culture where the exploits of tribal, clan, and family heroes were memorized, recited, and passed to the young as a matter of common practice. Ibn Ishaq's biography also includes additional original material, in the form of poems about the raids and battles written shortly after the events themselves, sometimes by actual participants. Ishaq's efforts thus preserved another valuable source of oral tradition, that otherwise might have been lost. The poems are often excellent sources of detail about military equipment and tactical events. Ibn Ishaq's Life of Muhammad, whether in Arabic or in Guillaume's definitive translation, remains the most basic work used by all biographers of Muhammad, including those writing in Arabic. The academic concern for original sources might lead some to criticize the material on which this study relies as secondary sources, and thus not sufficiently scholarly. If by original sources we at least mean that the materials ought to have been written as close as possible to the events they address, then Ibn Ishaq's work certainly qualifies. He is writing only 90 years after the events he is recording. Compared to the original sources often cited by ancient historians in the West, Ibn Ishaq's work is almost contemporaneous with the events themselves. Plutarch, for example, wrote about events that occurred 200 to 600 years before he wrote. Arrian's History of Alexander was written 500 years after Alexander's death. Curtius' History of Alexander was written between 300 and 500 years after the events it records, and Livy, the old reliable, wrote of events that occurred 2 centuries before he was born. Only a few ancient historians, Tacitus, Polybius, and Suetonius, to name the most obvious, wrote about events that actually took place during their lifetimes. By any fair standard of proximity to events, Ibn Ishaq qualifies as an original and reliable source. A second criticism will likely be that the work relies on translations of its original sources, and not on the original Arabic versions. 13 But only rarely do the language skills of any researcher equal those of a scholarly translator, so that one can be as certain as one can be in these matters that works by scholarly translators of Guillaume's standing are more reliable than those produced by a researcher simply because the researcher reads Arabic. As regards military history, a knowledge of the subject and context of the materials in the target language are more important than linguistic skills in the source language. Otherwise, the literal use of language will likely mislead the translator. Reading Arabic does not make one a translator of Arabic military history. One must be a military historian first. Moreover, modern translations of classic works are far more likely to be free of the ideological, cultural, and religious bias characteristic of those produced earlier when such prejudices commanded more attention. Whenever I have used materials from other Western or Arabic scholars, I have been careful to rely on only those who themselves read Arabic, and whose published works have already been subjected to academic scrutiny and found acceptable. I have not used scholarly Arabic transliterations for the various names and places mentioned herein, but have relied on the spellings used by my sources. Wherever applicable, I have also noted in the relevant footnotes the original Arabic sources, on which the accounts of these scholars were based. The Arabic words that appear in the manuscript were taken directly from the academic sources in which they appear. As such, they should all be correct. Some people might find fault with the Arabic transliterations because they are not expressed in classical Arabic. This is an inevitable risk of reading translations, but hardly a fatal flaw as long as the meaning is not changed by the spelling. These problems have been minimized through manuscript review by the 4 Arabic experts mentioned in the Acknowledgments. The third source of research material on which this work relies is the hadith, that is, verbal reports or conversations comprising the compilations of the traditions of Muhammad gathered some 120 years after the Prophet's death. These traditions are extrapolations of various sayings, words, deeds, and tacit approvals of the Prophet, accompanied by interpretations by lawyers, religious authorities, and others, including political factionaries with influence at any given time. The hadith represents the sunnah, or tradition, the customs and practices attributed to the Prophet Muhammad. As a historical source, this compilation can at best be regarded as repetitious of those accounts within Ibn Ishaq's work, or at worst as misleading and inaccurate. Because of the bias of the extrapolators themselves who interpret the reports. A major difficulty in using works published in Arabic after Ibn Ishaq's work is that Muhammad's utterances and oral accounts of events surrounding his life quickly became thickly entangled in the various interpretations of Quranic law that were used as propagandistic weapons in theological and political disputes by various factions to favor themselves and discredit their opponents. As Guillaume has noted in this regard, apostolic tradition in Islam is the battlefield of warring sects striving for the mastery of men's minds and the control of their behavior with all the weight that Muhammad's presumed or fabricated example could bring to bear. The earlier the tradition, the less this tendency is in evidence. 14. Much of what was written about Muhammad in Arabic in later periods following Ibn Ishaq's work is often so culturally, ideologically, linguistically, or theologically partisan as to be useless, as it encompasses almost 1.5 million square miles, an area slightly larger than all of Western Europe including Scandinavia. The ground itself is made up of a single uniform block of ancient rock called the Arabian Shield, and consists mostly of desert and steppe. The climate is uniformly hot, dry, and harsh, except for Yemen, which is blessed by monsoon rains and is fertile. The rest of the country is almost completely barren, receiving on average only 6 inches of rain per year. Arabia is divided into 4 geographic regions. One is Al-Hijaz, consisting of the western highlands that parallel the coast of the Red Sea. The mountains themselves reach as high as 4,000 feet, and separate the narrow coastal plain from the steppe land of the interior. A number of valley passes make it possible to travel from the interior to the coastal strip with only little difficulty. But the passes are few, and of some distance between, making the mountains a formidable. Map 2. Arabia, the land. Obstacle to military passage. running sometimes along the coast and sometimes on the interior side of the mountains, is the famous Arabian Spice Road, the route connecting the ports at the southern tip of the peninsula with the road to the north and the former Byzantine border provinces, including Palestine and Egypt. Ships from India and Africa unloaded their cargoes in these ports, where they were transferred to camel caravan trains and carried northward to Mecca, the commercial center located halfway between the ports and the markets farther north. This road was the commercial lifeline of Mecca and the entire westernmost area of the country. The second geographic zone is the interior, largely stony, sandy wastes and desert. The Rub al-Khali, or empty quarter, is a vast desert in the south that has large sand dunes sometimes reaching more than 100 feet high and running on for miles at a stretch. In the center of Arabia are the Nafid and Dana deserts, which constitute formidable barriers to west-east travel. In the north lies the Great Syrian Desert and the smaller wastes of Hizma and Hamad. The routes used by the Meccan caravan trains skirted these desolate areas. It was impossible for men or beasts to attempt a crossing and survive. The third zone lies far to the east and comprises the hot and humid coastal lands of the Persian Gulf, where agriculture is possible due to abundant groundwater. Far to the south is Yemen, the fourth zone, the famous land of antiquity from which the prized aromatic plants that produced frankincense and myrrh were found. Yemen is a land of towering mountains, fertile valleys, and coastal plains. The monsoon rains make the ground fertile and well suited to agriculture. The people of Yemen were mostly settled rather than nomadic and were skilled in the building of dams and irrigation systems that made large-scale agriculture feasible. One of these dams, at Marad, was said to have made possible the cultivation of more than 20,000 square acres of land. So large was the population supported by these lands that when the dam broke sometime near the beginning of the 2nd century CE, a great number of people were forced to migrate to the north. There are no permanent rivers anywhere in Arabia, and rainfall is sparse and limited to certain times of the year. In the south the rains come in the spring and summer. In the north winter and spring are the rainy seasons. The rains can be heavy at times and are often accompanied by gale force winds that can turn the wadi beds into raging torrents that wreak havoc on the mud brick houses and walled gardens. Driving. The land of Arabia. 5. Rains have been known to turn mud brick walls into mud, sweeping away the liquid mass in a localized flood. During Muhammad's time 5/6 of the population of Arabia was Bedouin, and permanent settlements were few. Ptolemy, writing in his Geography sometime around 150 CE, listed only 218 settlements in Arabia, of which more than 150 were small villages. Only 6 cities were listed, and all of these were in Yemen, where the land was sufficiently fertile to sustain large populations. Most of these cities were relatively small in both area and population, and only 2 were surrounded by walls of mud brick and stone. The length of the walls permit a rough estimate of the size of the populations. The walls of Karnaw were 1,150 meters in length, and those of Timna were 1,850 meters long. Walls of this size can enclose, on average, about 8 to 9 acres of land. Using Yigal-Yadin's estimate of approximately 240 persons per urban acre as the average population density for cities of the Middle East in antiquity, one might reasonably guess that the size of these cities was around 2,000 souls. The language of Arabia itself reflects the lack of urbanization in the land, for there is no word for city in classical Arabic. The most commonly used term in this context is Hagar, a word that connotes the fortified assembly place or compound of a tribe where its clans are brought together for war or other purposes. Muhammad spent most of his life in the Hijaz. With the exception of the mountains, the land of the Hijaz consists of desert and steppe. The steppe forms itself into vast circular plains lying between hills covered with sand. Large tracts of the steppe land are covered by fissured fields of hardened lava overlaying sandstone. These lava fields are important barriers to military and commercial movement, since neither horse nor camel can negotiate them without great risk of the animal's falling and breaking its limbs, or falling on its rider. There are few trees, and only the acacia and the tamarisk seem to thrive. The Hijaz is a rocky and harsh place given to drought, with the land often going without rain for 3 years at a time. Deeply dug wells and cisterns are the main means of water supply. Cisterns are cave-like holes dug in the ground, the walls of which are sealed with stucco, and into which water is diverted or caught from rainstorms. The cistern is then sealed until its contents are needed. It is an old Yauan custom to construct cisterns along a planned route of march so that the clan can be supplied with water as it moves over the desert. It was not unusual for Bedouin raiders to construct and fill a cistern in some desolate location from which they could undertake raids against caravans. Without a source of water themselves, the caravan guards were unable to pursue the raiders. In a few places groundwater seeps to the surface, forming a fetid, swamp-like area called an oasis. Most of the oases in the Hijaz are located north of Medina, itself the largest oasis in the region. The second largest oasis in the Hijaz is only 10 square miles in area. Although malaria is endemic, the oases are valuable for their water supply and their ability to sustain substantial agriculture. Agriculture was probably introduced to the area sometime around the 1st century CE, most probably by the Jewish tribes. The origins of the Jewish tribes in the Hijaz are obscure. One possibility is that the Jews that settled there were refugees from Roman suppression of the Bar Kokhba revolt in Israel in the early 130s CE, or from the prior Jewish war. Another is that the Jews migrated from Yemen after the destruction of the Great Dam at Marad, about 100 years later. By Muhammad's time, the Jewish tribes of the area were indistinguishable from the Arab tribes in structure, ethos, and behavior. Only their religious observance distinguished them from other Arab clans. Barley and millet were the major grain crops grown in the oases, and were used to make small bread-like cakes for human consumption. Among the animals, only horses were sometimes fed on grain, as a supplement to their grazing. Grapes were introduced sometime during the 4th century CE. The olive tree was unknown. The Jews and Nabateans were likely responsible for the importation of fruit trees to the area, and apples, oranges, lemons, watermelons, pomegranates, and bananas were cultivated. The most important of all Arabian crops was the date palm. It is likely that the date palm was introduced from Mesopotamia during very ancient times. The fruit of the date palm, together with the milk of camels and goats, is the chief food of the Bedouin. The date is often mixed with flour or roasted barley or millet, and washed down with milk or water. It is the wish of every Bedouin to have the 2 black ones, that is, plenty of dates to eat and water or camel milk to drink. Except for the flesh of a camel slaughtered for food, when its useful life was at an end, the date fruit was the Bedouins' only solid food. Muhammad took note of the importance of the date to the Arab way of life, when he said, "Honor your and the palm, which is made of the same clay as Adam 10. The land of Arabia. 7. In the harsh land of the Hijaz only the Bedouin was truly at home. Those who lived in the oases, or the few towns, often had to hire Bedouin guides to travel from one place to another, or hire them as personal and caravan guards to ensure a safe journey. The heat, trackless roads, lack of food, scarcity of water, and the general discomfort of life in the desert, while problematic during times of peace, became the allies of the Bedouin in times of war. His daily ration of dates and water would bring any other army to its knees in a few days, but the Bedouin could subsist on this diet forever. Living on dates, water, and the very camels that carried them, Arab armies were far more mobile than those of their adversaries. During the first battles of the Arab conquests, Arab armies chose battlefields that were close to the desert so that in the event of a defeat they could retreat into the desert, where the enemy could not follow. Perhaps it was this capability that King Faisal of Saudi Arabia had in mind when he responded to Secretary of State Henry Kissinger's threat that the U.S. Army might be forced to seize the Saudi oil fields if the Saudis did not bring down the price of OPEC oil to ease the energy crisis of 1973. Confronted with Kissinger's threat, Faisal is said to have smiled and replied, "We are Arabs. We will return to the desert and live on camel milk and dates, and find you from there forever." The Arabs of Muhammad's day wore clothing that was well suited to the harsh Arabian environment. Men wore a long shirt called a thawb tied with a belt around the waist. A long flowing robe-like garment that reached almost to the ground called an abar was worn over the thawb. The head was covered with a kind of shawl called a kufiyah held in place with a cord or a quill. Trousers were not usually worn, and most people went barefoot, although the later use of stirrups may have required sandals or some other form of footwear when riding. Arab clothing made an ideal military uniform given the climatic conditions. The loose-fitting garments provided adequate protection against the sun, and helped to hold in the body's moisture. Tents and blankets made of goats' or camel's hair afforded excellent protection against the cold of the desert night. The military kit of the Arab made it possible for Arab armies to move unencumbered by heavy baggage trains, and gave the armies of the later Arab conquests a mobility, speed, and range unmatched by their enemies. The Bedouin nomads of the Hijaz moved with their flocks on a regular basis, searching for pasture and water for their animals. These Arab nomads usually practiced a form of enclosed nomadism, that is, movement in a regular pattern that brought them close to settlements and towns where they could trade or purchase goods with the few meager resources that they possessed. The relationship between nomads and the settled populations was genuinely symbiotic in that neither could survive without the products of the other. The grain and dates that were staples of the nomads' diets were obtained in the oases, where they grew. Saddles, weapons, cloth, and other goods were manufactured in the towns. In return, the nomad provided the town dweller with goats, sheep, and camels, as well as the materials from which tents and blankets might be woven. Most Bedouins were desperately poor, and were almost always on the brink of malnutrition. Among Bedouins in times of drought or starvation, it was a not uncommon practice to bury their female babies alive in order to free up resources for the surviving adults and male infants. Moreover, spending long days watching animals graze made for stultifying boredom. It is not surprising that the ghazw, or raid, became a way of Bedouin life. Raiding the camps and flocks of other Bedouin or the outskirts of the towns, where the horses and camels were usually set to grazing, served two important functions. First, it provided a needed form of social stimulation, the only way in which the Bedouin could practice the manly virtues of the warrior. For the most part, these raids were more a rough sport than real conflicts. Pitched battles were usually avoided and casualties few. Raids sometimes resulted in individual combats between chiefs, but even these rarely resulted in death. The object of the raid, after all, was to steal the flocks. The second function of the raid was to act as a form of redistributing the wealth, a means of obtaining goods that would otherwise be unattainable by some Bedouin families. In a poor country like Arabia, where malnutrition was endemic, raiding was often the only way a man could improve his lot in life. Finally, the competition for water and grazing often led to skirmishes between Bedouin clans. In difficult climatic times, these skirmishes could become very intense, since to be defeated meant to be driven from the water and grass, and risk the destruction of the flocks. Still, it is hard to escape the impression that raiding was more a social enterprise than either a military or an economic one. Arabs often explain raiding in the following terms. Our business is to make raids on the enemy, on our neighbor, and on our brother, in case we find nobody to raid but our brother. 11. The land of Arabia. 9. The basis of Bedouin society was the clan. Every tent represented a family. An encampment of tents was a Yai. The members of an Hayi made up a Qawm, or clan. A number of clans related by blood and kin formed a Kabila, or tribe. All members of the same clan considered themselves as of one blood, and submitted to the authority of a single chief called a sheikh, whose power to command was limited by the fact that all males in the tribe were considered equals, who might reasonably disagree and even resist the sheikh in important matters. As an old Arab proverb put it, a man's clan are his claws. Loyalty to one's clan was unconditional. Anyone committing a crime inside the clan was either banished or killed by the clan members themselves. The murder of a clan member by someone outside the clan required all males to avenge the crime in any manner possible, the usual rules of chivalry in combat being ignored in favor of treachery and ambush. This was the Azabiya, or blood loyalty, that rendered anyone outside the clan devoid of any moral standing that might place limits on revenge. During Muhammad's day, the clan was the center of the Arabs' moral universe. Only members of the clan had any claim to ethical treatment, and even this bound only fellow members of the clan. Those outside the clan lacked any moral standing, and were treated accordingly. The Arabs of Muhammad's time lived in a harsh society in a harsh land. There were few laws and no institutions to afford justice or restrain violence. Only the blood feud and its threat of retaliation against a wrongdoer provided a rough balance of power to limit violence. Blood feuds were not to be taken lightly, since the feud did not end until the wrongdoer was dead, or some member of his tribe had been killed as compensation. Later, it became a common practice to limit the feud by paying the bloodwit, financial compensation usually in the form of a number of camels, to the person or clan against whom the wrong had been committed. This aside, anyone outside the clan remained without moral standing. When Muhammad divided the ethical world between believers and unbelievers, in which the latter might rightly be enslaved or even killed by the former, he was only extending the morality of the blood feud to religion. The religious community of believers to which absolute loyalty was owed, and outside of which there were no obligations, simply replaced the old clan community of blood and kin. 2. The strategic setting. Luck and timing often determine the success or failure of great causes. So it seems to have been in the case of Muhammad and the new religion of Islam. The initial success and survival of both depended on a favorable array of strategic circumstances that occurred far from Mecca and Medina and were quite beyond the control of Muhammad himself. Muhammad lived when political and social circumstances inside and outside Arabia were creating a dynamic that favored the religious and military success of Islam. It is pointless to question whether success would have been possible under another set of counterfactual circumstances. What is important is to understand the circumstances within the Arabian strategic environment that influenced the outcome of Muhammad's life, and how these circumstances contributed to his military success and the establishment of Islam. Much is sometimes made of the isolation enforced by Arabia's deserts, and the remoteness of places like Mecca and Medina. Such portrayals are accurate only in a geographic sense. In the broader social and political sense, however, Arabia during Muhammad's day was not isolated from the geopolitical and strategic forces that were influencing the great Byzantine and Persian empires that bordered Arabia. By the time of Muhammad's birth, Arabia was being strongly influenced by and entangled in Byzantine and Persian politics. The Arabian merchant class enjoyed frequent contact with both empires and had visited the towns and courts of the great powers in pursuit of their economic interests. The caravans that left Mecca for Damascus or Ila on the Gulf of Aqaba, the latter ultimately bound for Gaza and Egypt, or traveled northeast across the desert to Hira in Iraq, and the towns along the Persian Gulf brought the traders of Mecca into direct contact with the Byzantine and Persian officials. Mecca sent at least 2 large caravans a year to the imperial markets, and many smaller ones traveled there more frequently. Imperial influences in the form of religious and political ideas were everywhere in evidence in Arabian trading towns during Muhammad's lifetime. There is no reason to assume that Muhammad was any less aware of them than were other members of the merchant class to which he came to belong. Even the idea that a new prophet was about to appear somewhere in Arabia was perpetrated by various Christian sects in both the Byzantine and Persian empires. And the strength of one was necessarily perceived as a threat to the other, and one's weakness often proved an irresistible temptation to the predations of the other. This proximity produced continuous political, commercial, and military rivalry that resulted in wars and military clashes of considerable magnitude. Despite more than a half-millennium of rivalry and war, the frontier between the two great powers had remained almost unchanged, neither side gaining more than a short-term tactical advantage for its efforts. The collapse of the Roman Empire in the West at the hands of barbarian invaders had resulted in the loss of imperial control in the western provinces of Italy, Gaul, Spain, Britain, and much of what is now Eastern Europe too. The center of imperial government shifted to the Eastern Roman capital of Constantinople. Despite the devastating blow to the Western Empire, Rome lived on at Constantinople for another 1,000 years, until it finally met its end by military defeat at the hands of the Ottomans in 1453. At the time of Muhammad's birth, the Eastern Roman Empire was still a great power comprising Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt. It included substantial territory along the North African littoral as well. These provinces formed a continuous defensive arc bordering the eastern Mediterranean Sea, which was controlled by the Byzantine navy. Directly to the south lay the strategic setting. 13. The Desert of Arabia. The border raids to which the southern frontier had been subjected for centuries were more of a nuisance than a strategic threat. The most serious threat to Byzantine security came from whence it had always come, from Persia, to the east. The loss of the Roman West paralyzed the emperors of Constantinople into inaction for more than 50 years, during which no substantive attempt was made to re-establish Roman control over the lost provinces. When Emperor Justinian rose to the purple, he set about changing Roman policy, and undertook a military campaign to recover the western lands. Led by the great field commander Belisarius, the Eastern Romans managed to re-establish control over large tracts of North Africa and parts of Italy. The difficulty was that the balance of military power on the Perso-Roman frontier had always been precarious at best, the advantage of manpower and internal lines resting usually with the Persians. To wage his campaign in the west, Justinian had to strip the Persian border defenses of much of their manpower and resources, leaving the border open to Persian attack. The temptation proved too much for the Persians, and a series of large-scale military clashes took place along the border. Justinian, always the strategic realist, recognized the danger of a Persian invasion, and moved to forestall it through negotiation and concession. He negotiated the peace with the Persians to remove the invasion threat. While there is no doubt that the treaty was seen as temporary by both sides, the Romans surrendered some border towns and lands, and promised to make financial payments to keep the Persians at bay. In exchange, the Persian armies stood down. The Persian Empire was enormous, stretching from Afghanistan to the Oxus River to the far reaches of the modern region of Kurdistan. It was governed by a Sassanid dynasty, whose capital lay at the narrowing of the rivers Tigris and Euphrates at Ctesiphon, south of modern Baghdad. Constantinople's uneasy peace with Persia held until Justinian's death in 565. The empire then fell into a period of crisis brought on by a series of weak rulers that led to a military revolt in 602 that produced more confusion and weakness. The Persian emperor, Chosroes II, had never taken his eyes off the rich Roman cities, and in that same year he launched an invasion of the Roman territories. In 613 Persian armies captured Damascus, and a year later Jerusalem fell. The True Cross, Christendom's holiest relic, was carried off by the Persians, themselves Nestorian Christians. In 616 Persian armies occupied 14. Muhammad, Egypt and substantial parts of Asia Minor. The Byzantine Empire seemed on the verge of collapse and occupation, unable to reverse its military defeats. This serious set of circumstances caused elements of the Roman army in the east to rebel against the capital's corrupt rulers, a rebellion that proved ultimately to be Rome's salvation. One of the leaders of the rebellion, Heraclius, would become one of the empire's greatest emperors. Heraclius had deposed the Byzantine emperor, Phocas, and assumed power in 610. By now almost all of the eastern provinces were in Persian hands. Heraclius set out to recapture the occupied lands and destroy the Persian armies. In 4 major battles, Issus, the Halys River, the river Sarus, and Nineveh, Heraclius cut off the Persian armies, invaded Persia itself, and destroyed what was left of Persian military might, a series of defeats that ended the war. In 628 Chosroes was assassinated, and the Persian Empire collapsed into anarchy and dynastic struggle. Chosroes' successor, Kavad II, made peace with the Romans. The war had gone on for 26 years and exhausted both imperial powers. The boundaries agreed to in the peace treaty were essentially the same as had separated the two powers before the war began. The exhaustion of the major powers coincided with the period in which Muhammad undertook his insurgency. The significance of this coincidence lies in the limitations the weakness of the imperial powers placed on their ability to influence events in neighboring Arabia. Both powers had pursued their interests in Arabia for centuries. At times these efforts were pursued by proxy wars using rival coalitions of Arab tribes, at other times by outright invasion. By the time Muhammad began his insurgency, all these efforts had come to nothing. The ability of the great powers themselves, and what few of their proxies remained to influence events in Arabia, was seriously diminished. The important consequence was that there was no one in a position to oppose Muhammad's insurgency. The ties between the great powers and their proxies were strongly rooted in religious affiliation. This was especially so within the Byzantine realm, where the Orthodox faith was the official religion of the state, and where persecution of heretical Christian sects had reached alarming proportions. The Persians had adopted Nestorian Christianity, after it had been declared a heresy by Byzantine emperors, and its persecuted adherents had taken refuge in Persia. Syrians, Palestinians. The strategic setting. 15. 16. Map 3. Strategic setting during Muhammad's life, 570-632 CE. And Egyptians were mostly Monophysite Christians, another sect considered heretical by the Byzantine rulers. All these sects were associated in one way or another with imperial ambitions. Christianity had made some limited inroads in Arabia, the tribal clans often adopting the creed of their imperial allies. By Muhammad's time, the weakness of the imperial powers had also loosened their ties with their respective Arab allies, with the result that whatever religious influence had once been present was almost completely lost, as the tribes reverted to their traditional idol worship. Without imperial support, none of Christian sects, or their allies in Arabia, had the power or inclination to see Muhammad's religious movement as another dangerous heretical sect that had to be suppressed. There was no organized religious opposition from anywhere in Arabia to Muhammad's new creed. Had Muhammad attempted to establish Islam within the borders of either imperial realm, he would have encountered strong opposition from the sacerdotal classes and their allies that might have resulted in the suppression of the new religion and the execution or imprisonment of its messianic leader. Arab allies were an important element in the strategy of the great powers to protect their borders from Bedouin raids. Both empires created strong coalitions of Arab tribes led by powerful chiefs to protect the imperial borders. These chiefs were paid and given lavish gifts and official titles to increase their standing with their clan chiefs, who, in turn, depended on them for the patronage required to keep their own clans loyal. Had the imperial powers been able or inclined to oppose Muhammad as a threat to Christianity, they could have used these tribal allies to do so. Many of the Arab allies had become Christians themselves, and could have been employed to crush Muhammad and his insurgency on the grounds of heresy. They might have done so with comparative ease. The Arab Bani Ghassan family, or Ghassanids, served in the pay of the Romans to protect the southern border of Syria and Jordan from the Bedouins. The Ghassanids were Monophysites, a fact conveniently ignored by the Orthodox rulers of Constantinople, who required their services as border guards. To the east, the Persians pursued the same policy of hiring Arab allies to protect their border with Arabia. The Nestorian Christian Lakhmid tribes were Persian allies. So long as these tribal coalitions remained loyal to their respective clients, the desert frontiers were relatively safe from Arab raiders. These loyal Arab tribes were also the first line of strategic defense against any. The strategic setting. 17. Large-scale invasion attempted from the desert, an invasion that Muslim armies successfully carried out shortly after Muhammad's death. These imperial alliances with the Arab tribal coalitions had been the successful basis of imperial border defense for more than 100 years before Muhammad's birth. For reasons that are unclear, both great powers committed the same strategic mistake that resulted in each exposing their desert flanks to the same invader. In 581, the chief of the Ghassanids was arrested and imprisoned as a Monophysite heretic. This resulted in an open revolt by the Ghassanids, who now became raiders themselves. In 605, the Persian emperor quarreled with the chief of the Lakhmids and rescinded the chief's payments, position, and privileges. The Lakhmids went over to revolt and began sacking the towns along the Persian-Arabian border. The consequence of these short-sighted actions was to strip the imperial borders of both great powers of their respective protective military forces and expose them to Arab attack. The strategic danger was not immediately obvious, however. Muhammad was in the midst of his insurgency, and Islam was still in its infancy. There was as yet no Arab army capable of attacking the great powers. For the foreseeable future, the problem of border security remained one of defending against small-scale, sporadic Bedouin raids. By the time of Muhammad's death in 632, however, the strategic situation had changed considerably. One of Muhammad's greatest legacies was a large, trained, and well-led military force motivated by religious zeal and ready to exploit the only source of pillage and loot available to Arabs, whose new religion forbade attacks on one another. Islam's armies were ready to reach beyond the borders of Arabia, bringing the new Islamic faith to the east and west in their wake. Exhausted and bankrupt by years of pointless warfare, the Persians and Byzantines found themselves suddenly confronted with a grave military threat from Arabia itself. It was these circumstances of the larger strategic, religious, and social situation that formed the backdrop for Muhammad's life and prophethood and increased his prospects for success. The movement toward Christian monotheism within the Byzantine and Persian empires had penetrated Arabia long before Muhammad was born. The idea of a single God, and even the coming of a new prophet were widely held at the time of Muhammad's insurgency. The religious persecution fiercely practiced by the Byzantines but less so by Persians against so-called heretical sects, and sometimes against their own Arab allies, made it impossible for the great powers to project force against the new creed of Islam, thus permitting Muhammad a free hand to begin his insurgency and establish the new religion free from outside interference.
Muhammad's death, many of the clans that had sworn allegiance to Islam recanted, resulting in the War of the Apostates. It was the military brilliance of Muhammad's generals and the superior combat capabilities of his new army that made it possible for Islam to defeat the apostates and force them back into the religious fold. It was these same generals commanding the new Arab armies that made possible the Arab conquests of the Persian and Byzantine empires. The old Arab way of war would have had no chance to win against the armies of either of these powers. In this sense, Muhammad's military revolution was an event that shook the ancient world and changed its history by creating the means that made the Arab conquests possible. Muhammad's successful transformation of Arab warfare marks him as one of the great military reformers of the ancient world. Muhammad stands in good company with those whose military reforms made possible the creation of empires by their successors. Kamose of Egypt led the fight against the Hyksos occupiers, reforming in the process the Egyptian army and making it possible for Thutmose III, the Napoleon of Egypt, to create the Egyptian Empire of the New Kingdom. Philip II of Macedon completely changed the manner of classical Greek warfare, forging a military instrument with which he united all Greece and which his son, Alexander the Great, used to create the empire of the Hellenes. The reforms of Augustus Caesar created the professional Roman army, making possible the expansion of the Roman Empire to its greatest geographic extent. And it was Muhammad who reformed Arab warfare and fashioned the military instrument his successors used to establish the great empire of Islam. Social composition. Muhammad changed the social composition of Arab armies from a collection of clans, tribes, and bloodkin loyal only to themselves into a national army loyal to a national social entity called the Ummah, or community of believers in God. The Ummah was not a nation or a state in the modern sense, but a body of religious believers under the Arab warfare. 43. Unified command and governance of Muhammad. It was a locus of loyalty that transcended the clans and tribes and permitted Muhammad to forge a common identity, national in scope, among the Arabs for the first time. It was leadership of this national entity that Muhammad claimed, not of any clan or tribe. Loyalty to the Ummah permitted the national army to unify the two traditional combat arms of infantry and cavalry into a genuine combined military force. Historically, Bedouin and town dweller had viewed one another with considerable suspicion, each living a very different way of life and fighting very different types of battles. Arab infantry had traditionally been drawn from the people living in the towns, settlements, and oases of Arabia. While the larger towns often had a sufficient number of wealthy men who could afford horses, these cavalry units were generally small and ineffective. Arab cavalry was traditionally drawn from Bedouin clans whose nomadic warriors excelled at speed, surprise attack, and elusive retreat, skills honed to a fine edge over generations of raiding. 58. These two different kinds of soldiers came from different socio-economic backgrounds, and each possessed only limited experience in fighting alongside the other. Bound by clan loyalties and living in settlements, Arab infantry was steadfast and cohesive and could usually be relied on to hold its ground, especially in the defense. The infantry constituted the core of Muhammad's army throughout his life and remained so in the armies of the Arab conquest. Arab cavalry was unreliable in a fight against infantry, often breaking off the fight to escape damage to their precious mounts or make off with whatever booty they had seized. Bedouin cavalry was, however, proficient at the surprise attack, protecting the flanks, and pursuing ill-disciplined infantry. Each arm lacked the strengths of the other. Muhammad was the first commander of an Arab army to join successfully both combat arms into a national Arab army and use them in concert in battle. This was more than a mere technical reform. The ability to combine both combat arms was the result of Muhammad's creation of a new type of community that made it possible to submerge the clan and blood loyalties of traditional Arab society into the larger religious community of believers, the Ummah, and combine the two primary elements of traditional Arab society, town dwellers and Bedouin tribes, into a single Arab national identity. The change in the social composition of Arab armies under Muhammad was preceded by a change in the social composition of Arab society. Unity of command. Before Muhammad, Arab military contingents fought under the command of their own clan or tribal leaders, sometimes assembled in coalition with other clans or tribes. While the authority of these clan chiefs was recognized by their own clan, every clan chief considered himself the equal of any other, with the result that there was no overall commander whose authority could compel the obedience or tactical direction of the army as a whole. Clan warriors fought for their own interests, often only for loot, and did not feel obligated to pursue the larger objectives of the army as a whole. They often failed to report to the battlefield, arrived late, or simply left the fight once they had captured sufficient loot. Warriors and horses were precious, and clan leaders often resisted any higher tactical direction that might place their men and animals in danger. Under these conditions, Arab battles often resembled little more than disorganized brawls lasting but a short time and producing no decisive outcome. To correct these deficiencies, Muhammad established a unified command for his armies. Command was centered in his hands alone. Within the Ummah there was no distinction between the citizen and the soldier, at least if the battle was considered defensive. All members of the community had an obligation to defend the clan and participate in its battles. The community of believers was truly a nation at arms, and all believers followed the commands of Muhammad, God's messenger. As commander-in-chief, Muhammad established the principle of unified command by appointing a single commander with overall authority to carry out military operations. Sometimes a second-in-command was appointed as well. Muhammad often commanded his troops in the field himself. All other commanders were appointed by him and operated under his authority. As Muslims, all members of the army were equally bound by the same laws, and all clan members and their chiefs were subject to the same discipline and punishments as all Muslims. When operating with clans who were not Muslims, Muhammad always extracted an honor oath from their chiefs to obey his orders during the battle. The establishment of a unified military command gave Muhammad's armies greater reliability in planning and in battle. Unified command also permitted a greater degree of coordination among the various combat elements of the army and the use of more sophisticated tactical designs that could be implemented with more certainty. Arab warfare. 45. Thereby greatly increasing the army's combat power. For the first time Arab forces became an instrument of their commander's tactical will. After Muhammad's death and during the Ridda, Muhammad's successor, Abu Bakr, replaced many of the old generals who had fought under Muhammad with new officers selected mostly from among the generals of Mecca. Unity of command extends not only to the strategic level, but to the operational and tactical levels as well. The fact that the old commanders could be replaced and the troops, tribes, and clans under them would obey Meccan commanders who, after all, had been their former enemies, is testimony to Muhammad's success in establishing unity of command as a major institutional reform in Arab armies. Combat unit cohesion. The moral basis of traditional Arab warfare placed an emphasis on the courageous performance of individual warriors in battle. While every warrior recognized that he was part of a larger king group, Arab warfare placed no emphasis on the ability of the clan to fight as a unit. The Arab warrior fought for his own honor and social prestige within the king group, not for the clan per se. One consequence was that Arab armies and the clan units within them did not usually reflect the high degree of combat unit cohesion, the ability of the group to remain intact and fight together under the stress of battle. Muhammad's armies, by contrast, were highly cohesive. These armies usually held together even when they fought outnumbered or were overrun. Muhammad did not just strengthen the blood and king ties of the traditional Arab clan. He went far beyond that in creating the Ummah as a higher locus of the soldiers' loyalty that transcended the clan. It is important to remember that many of Muhammad's early converts had left their families and clans to follow the Prophet. It was a common occurrence to find members of the same clan and family, and even fathers and sons, fighting on opposite sides during Muhammad's early battles. Religion turned out to be a greater source of unit cohesion than blood and clan ties, the obligations of faith replacing and overriding the obligations of tradition and even family. Muhammad's soldiers quickly gained a reputation for their discipline and ferocity in battle, soldiers who cared for each other as brothers, which under the precepts of Islam they were. Motivation. Muhammad's armies demonstrated a higher degree of military motivation than traditional Arab armies. Being a good warrior had always been the central core of Arab military values. Muhammad raised the status of the warrior to an even greater degree. It was a common saying among Muslims that the soldier is not only the noblest and most pleasing profession in the sight of Allah, but also the most profitable. 59 Muhammad's soldiers were always guaranteed a share in the booty. Instead of the usual 1/4, Muhammad himself took 1/5 of the booty in the name of the Ummah, leaving more booty to be distributed to the soldiers. Under these arrangements, Muhammad's soldiers were actually paid better than Persian or Byzantine soldiers. 60. But better pay was only a small part of the motivation of the soldiers of Islam. The idea of a soldier motivated by religion and the certainty that he was doing God's work on earth seems to have been one of Muhammad's most important military innovations. There were, of course, Christian soldiers who must have felt that they were doing their religious duty even when they attacked their fellow Christians denounced as heretics. But no army before Muhammad ever placed religion at the center of military motivation and defined the soldier primarily as an instrument of God's will on earth. The soldiers of Islam were usually extremely religious and saw themselves as fighting under God's instructions. The result, often still seen in Islamic societies, was a soldier who enjoyed much higher social status and respect than soldiers in armies of the West. A central part of the motivation of the Islamic soldier was the teaching of his faith that death was not something to be feared, but to be sought. Muhammad's pronouncement that those killed in battle would be welcomed immediately into a paradise of pleasure and eternal life, because they died fulfilling the command of God, was a powerful inducement to perform well on the field of battle. To die fighting in defense of the faith was to become a martyr. Life itself was subordinate to the needs of the faith. To die a martyr was to fulfill God's will. Muslim soldiers killed in battle were accorded the highest respect on the Arab scale of values. While those who died in battle had been traditionally celebrated as examples of courage and selflessness, it was never suggested that death was to be welcomed or even required to be. Arab warfare. 47. A good soldier. Muhammad's religious pronouncements changed the traditional Arab view of military sacrifice and produced a far more dedicated soldier than Arab armies had ever witnessed before. Strategic war. Arab warfare prior to Muhammad's reforms involved clans and tribes fighting for honor or loot. No commander aimed at the enslavement or extermination of the enemy, nor the occupation of its lands. Arab warfare was tactical warfare, nothing more. There was no sense of strategic war in which long-term, grand-scale strategic objectives were sought and toward which the tactical application of force was directed. Muhammad was the first to introduce the notion of war for strategic goals to the Arabs. Muhammad's ultimate goal, the transformation of Arab society through the spread of a new religion, was strategic in concept. His application of force and violence, whether unconventional or conventional, was always directed at the strategic goal. Although Muhammad began as an insurgent, he was always Clausewitzian in his thinking in that the use of force was seen not as an end in itself but as a tactical means to the achievement of strategic objectives. Muhammad was the first Arab commander to use military force within a strategic context. Had he not introduced this new way of thinking to Arab warfare, the use of later Arab armies to forge a world empire would have been not only impossible, but unthinkable. Once war was harnessed to strategic objectives, it became possible to expand its application to introduce tactical dimensions that were completely new to traditional Arab warfare. Muhammad used his armies in completely new ways. He attacked tribes, towns, and garrisons before they could form hostile coalitions. He isolated his enemy by severing their economic lifelines and disrupting their lines of communication. He was a master at political negotiation, forming alliances with pagan tribes when it served his interests. He laid siege to cities and towns. Muhammad also introduced the new dimension of psychological warfare, employing terror and even massacre as means to weaken the will of his enemies. Various texts mention Muhammad's use of the catapult and movable covered car in siege warfare. 61 Most likely these siege devices were acquired in Yemen, where Persian garrisons had been located on and off over the centuries. Muhammad seems to have been the first Arab commander to use them in the north, where once Arab warfare had been a completely tactical affair. Muhammad's introduction of strategic war permitted the use of tactics in the proper manner, as means to greater strategic ends. War, after all, is never an end in itself. It is, as Clausewitz reminds us, always a method, never a goal. Experienced Combat Officer Corps. As an orphan, Muhammad lacked even the most rudimentary military training provided by an Arab father. Perhaps to compensate for this deficiency, he surrounded himself with other men who were experienced warriors. He constantly asked questions of these more experienced soldiers and frequently took their advice. He frequently appointed the best warriors of his former enemies to positions of command once they had converted to Islam. As commander-in-chief, Muhammad sought to identify and develop good officers wherever he found them. Young men were appointed to carry out small-scale raids in order to give them combat experience. He sometimes selected an officer from a town to command a Bedouin raid in order to broaden his experience in the use of cavalry. 62 Muhammad always selected his military commanders on the basis of their proven experience and ability, and never for their asceticism or religious devotion. 63 He was the first to institutionalize military excellence in the development of an Arab officer corps of professional quality. It was from Muhammad's corps of trained and experienced field commanders that the generals who commanded the armies of the conquests were drawn. Khalid al-Walid and Amr ibn al-As were both former Meccan enemy commanders who converted to Islam and served as field commanders in Muhammad's armies. Both became great generals during the Arab conquests. Training and discipline. We have only scant references to how Muhammad trained his soldiers. That he did so is almost a certainty. There are clear references to required training in swimming, running, and wrestling. The early soldiers of Islam had left their clan and family loyalties behind in order to join the Ummah. The clan-based military units typical of Arab warfare would have been impossible to recreate within the Ummah-based armies. Muhammad's converts had to be socialized to a new basis of military loyalty, the faith, and new military units would have had to be created. Arab warfare. 49. That contained soldiers for many clans. References in various texts suggest that Muhammad trained these units in rank and drill, sometimes personally formed them up and addressed them before a battle, and deployed them to fight in disciplined units, not as individuals as was the common practice. These disciplined artificial clan units could then be trained to use a wider array of tactical designs than was heretofore possible. Muhammad's use of cavalry and archers in concert with his infantry was one result. While Arab fathers continued to train their sons in warfare long after Muhammad's death, the armies of the Arab conquests, and later those of the Muslim Empire, instituted formal military training for recruits. Logistics and force projection. Muhammad seems to have had the caravanner's concern for logistics and planning, an expertise that permitted him to project force and carry out operations over long distances across inhospitable terrain. Muhammad had been an organizer of caravans for 25 years before he began his insurgency. During that time he made several trips to the north along the Spice Road. He gained a reputation for honesty and as an excellent administrator and organizer of caravans. Planning a caravan required extensive attention to detail and knowledge of routes, rates of march, distances between stops, water and feeding of animals, location of wells, weather, places of ambush, and so on, knowledge that served him well as a military commander. Unlike some other armies that he fought, Muhammad never seems to have had to change or abandon his plans due to logistical difficulties. Muhammad's armies could project force over hundreds of miles. In 630 he led an army of 20,000 to 30,000 men over a 250-mile march from Medina to Tabuk, lasting 18 to 20 days across the desert during the hottest season of the year. By traditional Arab standards, Muhammad's ability to project forces of such size over these distances was nothing short of astounding. Without this capability, the Arab conquests that followed Muhammad's death would have been impossible.